Good evening. I'm Larry Allums, Executive Director Emeritus of the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, and it's wonderful to have you with us for this 16th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Symposium, our first and we hope our last exclusively virtual symposium. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking our program sponsors that you have seen on your screen during the reception, without whose generous support this evening would not be possible. First and foremost, our program sponsors, John and Dorothy Castle, also our entertainment sponsors, Gwyneth and Albert Black and Nancy Kane Robertson, and our supporting sponsors, Betty and Russell Bellamy and Megan and Casey McManaman. I want to acknowledge the dedicated work of the Dallas Institute's Board of Directors, led by Chair David Griffin. And finally, I have the honor of expressing, as I have every MLK Day since 2006, my happy debt to two men I've already mentioned, Mr. John Castle and Mr. Albert Black, for coming to me in 2005 with the idea for this symposium, and for giving me guidance, both material and spiritual, ever since. These two men would have marched with Reverend King. About a decade ago, one of this nation's great African-American preachers, Reverend Michael Eric Dyson, called for a moratorium on Dr. King's most famous speech, I Have a Dream, the one delivered before hundreds of thousands in Washington, D.C. in 1963. Because he maintained it was too often being perversely used to color in softer tones Dr. King's radical stance on racism and poverty among African Americans and other marginalized groups. Today, particularly since the death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, it seems that the moratorium has begun to be lifted and Reverend King's truly radical message is being rediscovered. Not a single word of his dream is outdated or irrelevant, but by the end of his life in 1968, he was asserting that the crises and achievements of the 50s and 60s were the necessary but easier challenges facing those who would defeat racism and white supremacy. In 1967, he said that, quote, "We must see that the struggle is much more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality, and it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job." And clearly, Dr. King understood that the inequality he was fighting was rooted then, as it is now, in the original sin that casts an indelible shadow over our founding, the system of slavery that engendered white supremacy. Today, more than 50 years after his death, the legacy of slavery continues to make its impact on the dream of what Reverend King called genuine equality. We are gathered together this evening on the national holiday commemorating his life and legacy to consider and ponder these things. And so now let us turn to our program, which begins with two bright Dallas stars. First, we will hear a rendition of Hope by Dallas-based award-winning performer Denise Lee.
Come to sing a song about hope. I'm not inspired much right now, but even so, I came out here to sing a song, so here I go. I guess I think that if I tinker long enough, one might appear. And look, it's here. One verse is done. The work's begun. I've come to sing a song about hope. In spite of everything ridiculous and sad, though I'm beyond belief depressed, confused, and mad, got dressed, I underestimated how much that would take. I didn't break until right now. I sing of hope and don't know how. Maybe I can substitute strength because I'm strong. I'm strong enough. I got through lots of things I never thought I could. And so have you. I know it's true. And so we sing a song about hope. Though I can't guarantee there's something real behind it, I have to try to show my daughters I can find it. And so today, when life is crazy and impossible to bear, it must be there. Fear never wins. That's what I hope. See, I said hope. The work begins.
Thank you, Denise, for that honest and very timely song. And now please welcome actor and voiceover artist, Mr. Jamal Sterling, who will read selections from the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance. Jamal.
Harlem by Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? America by Claude McKay, 1889 to 1948. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess, I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood. Give me strength wrecked against her hate. Her bigness sweeps my being like a flood, yet as a rebel fronts a king and state. I stand within her walls with not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly I gaze into the days ahead. I see her might and granite wonders there. Beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking in the sand. Dinah Kneading Dough by Paul Laurence Dunbar, 1872 to 1906. I have seen full many a sight, born of day or drawn by night. Sunlight on a silver stream, golden lilies all a dream. Lofty mountains, bold and proud, veiled beneath the lace-like cloud. But no lovely sight I know equals Dinah kneading dough. Brown arms buried elbow deep, their domestic rhythm keep, as with steady sweep they go, through the gently yielding dough. Maids may vaunt their finer charms, not to me, like Dinah's arms. Girls may draw or paint or sew. I love Dinah, kneading dough. Eyes of jet, teeth of pearl. Hair, some say, too tight a curl. But that dainty maid I deem very near perfection's dream. Swift she works and only flings me a glance, the least of things. And I wonder, does she know that my heart is in the dough? Sonnet to a Negro in Harlem by Helen Johnson, 1907 to 1995. You are disdainful and magnificent, your perfect body and your pompous gait, your dark eyes flashing solemnly with hate. Small wonder that you are incompetent. To imitate those whom you so despise, your shoulders towering high above the throng, your head thrown back in rich barbaric song, palm trees and mangoes stretched before your eyes. Let others toil and sweat for labor's sake, and wring from grasping hands their meed of gold. Why urge ahead your supercilious feet? Scorn will efface each footprint that you make. I love your laughter, arrogant and bold. You are too splendid for this city street. The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen his muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Thank you, Jamal, for that powerful reading. And now I'd like to ask the president of the Dallas Institute, Dr. Simi Ali, to come and present the centerpiece of this year's MLK Symposium. Dr. Ali.
Thank you, Dr. Allums, and hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us for our celebration of Martin Luther King Day at the Dallas Institute. Since 2006, Dr. Allums has partnered with our marvelous friends, Albert Black and John Castle, to call our attention to the remarkable legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. The series is a testament to Dr. Allums' particular dedication to a distinctively American dream, a dream that we can, in Dr. King's words, lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. I've seen that solid rock of brotherhood in conversations between Dr. Allums, Mr. Black, and Mr. Castle. And I'm grateful and honored to receive that baton from Dr. Allums, deeply honored by the opportunity to welcome and introduce Professor Annette Gordon-Reed to the Dallas Institute's audience. Dr. Martin Luther King's most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, begins with a clear reference to what Dr. King calls the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. These words, he said, effectively serve as a promissory note to which every American is heir. Professor Gordon-Reed's career has been dedicated to helping us understand the chief author of this promissory note, Thomas Jefferson. Thanks in large part to Professor Gordon-Reed's groundbreaking 2008 book, The Hemingses of Monticello, we've now come to accept that Jefferson was a complex figure, a character full of contradictions. Today, at a particularly stressful juncture in our national history, I would like to emphasize what is most impressive, most powerful about the way Professor Gordon-Reed engages her difficult research. It is a simple fact that Professor Gordon-Reed resolutely respects human individuals and human individuality, even under circumstances of maximum strain, enslavement. Indeed, Professor Gordon-Reed is self-conscious about rejecting easy, generalizing, or ideologically convenient fictions about those she discusses. She patiently sets aside cookie-cutter labels, which others might be inclined to impose upon the difficult and complicated world she describes. And yet she does not shy away from the horror of that world. Rather, she insists above all on the individuality, the agency, the intelligence, the creativity, the specific character of the particular human beings she considers, even when they endure the most trying of circumstances. Another way to say it, Professor Gordon-Reed's work is insistently humane. In this way, Professor Gordon-Reed provides a real model for what we at the Dallas Institute prize and what is truly distinctive about the humanities, about the kingdom of culture in which we are all co-workers. It is my distinct honor to welcome Professor Gordon-Reed to the Dallas Institute for our 2021 Martin Luther King Symposium.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I was very glad to be present for the wonderful song and the readings of the poetry before my talk. Lansing Hughes is quite something, and I love all of those poems. This is indeed an amazing time to talk to you. I'm deeply honored to be able to talk to you at a historic moment. 2020 was quite something as a year, and 2021 is off to an interesting start as well. So it's an auspicious occasion, I think, to talk about Dr. King and to talk about his vision for America that, as was just mentioned, was rooted to a great degree in an understanding about what has been called America's creed, the American Declaration of Independence, with those words about the equality of mankind, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that have inspired people all over the world. They inspired people at the time that they were written, even people who were as far away from that ideal about equality as you could be, enslaved people in the United States of America, both in the North and the South. And whenever people had an opportunity, a number of them used the words of the Declaration as a basis for freedom suits. Some were successful, most not. But the point is, whether Jefferson believed all of those things and the people who said they believed them did or not, the fact is those words unleashed something that Dr. King and all of us are still working towards until this particular moment. This is not to sugarcoat matters. The Declaration was born in a terrible time for African Americans in this country, and most of them were enslaved during that time period. Slavery was based upon and helped fuel white supremacy, a doctrine that we're still living with today. And those hopeful signs that were raised, the hopes were lifted because of the Declaration, were lifted in a moment of extreme stress on the Black community and on people who were supporters of members of the Black community. We started out in a country where the people were supposed to be white people. The Naturalization Act of 1790 allowed only free white people to come to the country. So even at the beginning, there was a thought that this was a country for white people. There was not a sense that or understanding of how Black people were going to be incorporated into the United States of America. Jefferson went back and forth on this question, believed at one point that he was going to change things at Monticello and train African Americans to become useful citizens, as he said, and he abandoned that idea. That was just sort of a fleeting moment for him. In Notes on the State of Virginia, he voiced the opinion that many whites at that time felt, is that slavery was a wrong that was done to African Americans, but he could not foresee, could not understand how there could be a multiracial society in the United States of America. So slavery was a radical injustice. Emancipation had to be enacted. And at the same time, after that, African Americans should go back to Africa or find their own country. At first, he thought of perhaps maybe in the Western Territory, then maybe in the Caribbean or Africa. But the point was Black and white people could not live together in the way that King talked about. And that's when he says at the stirring part of the speech, all of us getting together, because he understood that that was a radical dream. And as I suggested, Jefferson did not believe that that was possible. Black people would never forgive whites for what had been done to them in slavery. How could you love a country where you had been treated that way? White people would never give up their prejudices against African Americans. And strangely enough, he thought that there could be no wholesale mixing of the races, that that would be anathema to most white people. And as he said, it was anathema to him, although we understand that that's part of the complexity that was referred to earlier in the introduction. So this was a vision of hope about the equality of mankind that existed alongside a deep pessimism about the question of race and about the possibility of ever having a society, a people, where we could be one people. African Americans who consider themselves Americans, because we have been here since the 1600s, 1700s, we are part of this country, never doubted for a moment that we were Americans, that we belonged here, because this is where we had lived, this is where we had toiled, this is where we'd had families, and we belonged here. That was an open question about whether or not we were the people. After Jefferson's death, and we have the sort of rise of democracy that was spurred by Jefferson in the Jacksonian era, it was decided and was talked about openly that this was a white man's government, that this country was not for Black people. Even places like Pennsylvania, where Blacks had been able to vote, the vote was rescinded. It was taken away. That right was taken away from African Americans in the 1830s. So this notion of progress, inevitable progress, really didn't play out that way. There were advances and retreats, and we went through this period where the notion of the United States was very openly thought of as a place that was supposed to be for white people, even though we talked about the ideals of the Declaration and being a country that was based upon an idea. The undercurrent was always this sense that this was a country for Europeans. Abolitionists, people who were opposed to slavery, even people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, people who we think of as the champions of African Americans, and they were, in fact, in the sense that they were anti-slavery, also believed in emancipation and expatriation, because people just couldn't see how you could be one country with people in different races. If you think about it, a country is supposed to be a place where everyone is together. Everyone has equal rights. You can marry, you can form families together. You become one people in that way. And that was not something that Jefferson or Stowe or Lincoln, for that matter, could envision at the time. How can you say that we are equal citizens, but say, you can't be in my family? And that was the way things were at that particular time. And it's something that we still haven't an issue that we still haven't resolved totally today. I was reading in the past, actually last year, when there were commercials that had blacks and whites in them as married couples or whatever, and there are complaints in 2021 with people who don't like that. So to look back at the 19th century and see people being hesitant about that, and we're hesitant about that today, tells you something about how deeply rooted these ideas are. So abolitionists pressed the question of slavery, even though the question of white supremacy and racial separation was not a part of that. Being anti-slavery did not mean that you were anti-racist, is another way of putting it. Civil War ends slavery, and the period of Reconstruction begins under the helm of a person who was probably the worst person you could have as president. Lincoln may have been the best person we could have had during the time of the conflict of the Civil War. And for that reason, many people think he was our greatest president. But certainly one of the worst presidents we had followed him. A man, Andrew Johnson, a man who had the virtue, I should say, of being the only Southern official who decided to remain in the Union, and for that reason became Lincoln's vice president. In a show of unity, Lincoln picked him to say that the North and the South could be together, the sort of a symbolic notion. And it made sense to do that, but for one thing. Andrew Johnson had, as his friends, even his friends said, an implacable hatred of African-American people. And you could think of the misfortune of the country, people being in the right place in the right time and people being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Johnson in place when the country was on the road had to deal with this question of how you bring 4 million enslaved people into the American nation. And his idea into citizenship in the American nation, I should say. And his idea was all that should happen is that enslaved people should be freed, and that's it. Black people should exist as serfs, the equivalent of serfs, people who had no power, no voting rights, existing basically at the mercy of whites. That was his prescription. He fought every progressive attitude, every progressive measure towards bringing Black peoples into citizenship. He fought it. The Freedmen's Bureau, whatever. He did this. And people say that his recalcitrance gave us the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is great. It took a long time for us to make the best use of it. But still, think of what it would have been like if you had a president who had the vision, who had the temperament that would have allowed him to say, yes, these people were enslaved. Yes, I'm a racist, but who saw the country making a sacrifice for the country so that everybody could do better. The notion of a rising tide lifting all boats or whatever, that for education, citizenship, all those kinds of things. If we'd had somebody who was less directly opposed to African-American advancement, what the difference of our country would have made. Thurgood Marshall, in the case of Bakke, the affirmative action case, in his opinion, refers to this. He said, what would have happened if we had done the right thing during that time period, rather than having the forces of reaction try to stop the advancement of Black people during the moment when it would have been crucial to try to make things better, to try to bring these people bring us into citizenship. And you know what happened from there. Jim Crow, Southern redemption, the notion that Reconstruction was just a part of an effort on the part of Northerners to punish the South by imposing what they would have called Negro rule, and used another word for it, but that was the mantra, that Negro rule, and that whites were being crushed underfoot by Black people. But really what it was taking people who had been at the lowest rung of society and giving them the rights of citizenship. And that was something that was anathema to people in the South. And it was anathema to some people in the North as well. We don't want to let the North get off the hook here because they did not have plantation slavery. This idea of white supremacy, which has been referred to a couple of times tonight, was something that was pervasive in the South and in the North. It expressed itself in different ways. But it's important for us to keep these things in mind. I mean, I don't think we're hostages to history. William Faulkner has a wonderful quote about the past not being past, really. It's not dead. It's not even past. I don't agree with that totally. I think the past is past, but the legacies of the past live on with us. And as much as people don't like to talk about race or if they have difficulty talking about race and racism in history, we have to be honest about this, that white supremacy was a doctrine that fueled people's understandings, fueled the culture, fueled the law, and shaped the way people thought about African American people, and it blighted the lives of millions of people. And at the same time, it kept the country down. I mean, the South, it wasn't just African Americans who suffered because of the lack of development of the African American community. The South as a whole, if you'd had everybody in public schools, everybody being educated, having money spent on their education, childcare, healthcare, all those kinds of things, child welfare, I mean to say, if you paid attention to those kinds of things for white people and Black people, the South itself would have been lifted. So this isn't something that has just been a Black problem. It's a problem for the country as a whole. And it took us many, many decades to get out of that. Martin Luther King was the product of a process that had started in the early 20th century. Black people always resisted Jim Crow, resisted the attempts to stop us from recognizing our citizenship. We think of the Niagara movement that became the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois and others, William Monroe Trotter, who started this organization at the beginning of the 20th century for purposefully to try to act against this idea that Blacks should not be citizens of America. People who had fought in every single war that the country's ever fought, people who paid taxes, but who were nevertheless seen as second-class citizens. And the one point I want to make about Jefferson that I intended to make before in thinking about citizenship, one of the difficulties he had in thinking about African Americans living in the United States was this question of full citizenship. For Jefferson, in a Republican society, Republican with a small r, there could be no first-class and second-class citizenship. He could not have envisioned that. He also knew his point about prejudice is that white people would be reluctant to give up their prejudices. And so what you would have would be a society in which there were first and second class citizens. And that would have been something that he could not envision, seeing that would be a threat to republicanism, that is to say, democracy. That would be a threat to our democracy to have first and second class or third class citizens. So he didn't see how it was going to work. He didn't understand. He couldn't see how we could exist as a society on a couple of tracks with people who had full citizenship and people who had lesser citizenship. So that was the thing that was motivating him to thinking about what would a society look like where you had that going on, and he couldn't envision it. But that's in fact what we created, certainly, and sort of put by law after the advent of Jim Crow laws that made legal separation, the order of the day in the South and other parts in the North as well. There were restrictive covenants on deeds in the North that prevented people from selling their homes to Black people in a society that's supposed to be capitalistic. The free market said that you couldn't sell property, you couldn't alienate property because you could, if you intended to sell it to a Black person. So there are all these ways of enforcing these notions of white supremacy, the separation of races, first and second class citizenship that played itself out after after the turn of the century of the 20th century. And as I was about to say, Martin Luther King was the product of a process that began in the early 20th century. People filing court cases against the white primary, all of these kinds of things. Lawyers who worked diligently in cases in little towns in the South, courageously in little towns in the South, and a strategy of moving against de jure legalized segregation. And when King came along, what he was able to do was to add the other element to that, the element of direct action, of protesting against segregation, of making this something that people of the world over could look at and see what the country was actually like. Now, we were unfortunate in this, fortunate/fortunate in this effort, because after World War II, there were a couple of things happened. First place, anytime men go off to war and come back, fighting for their freedom overseas, fighting for the freedom of the United States and protection of the United States, and you come back to the country and you're treated like second-class citizens, it becomes intolerable. So there was a different attitude on the part of African-American men who had fought overseas in World War I and certainly in World War II. Things began to change. And this idea of taking this without protest, again, was something that people were not going to do. So the combination of fighting against communism, the sort of a newfound, I don't want to say militancy, newfound aggressiveness on the part of African Americans to press for their rights, and the fact that the United States was fighting what they considered to be an existential battle with the Soviet Union and with communist China, another system of government that we saw ourselves competing with. And as countries in Africa and other places drew off their colonial powers, the question was, what were we going to do? Were you going to become communist? Are you going to be on our side? So this competition, there was a competition for values that aided the progress of the civil rights movement. Not to say that so King is important, obviously, and I think he would be the first to acknowledge all the other people and all the other forces that made this movement even more powerful. And certainly the Cold War was one of them. The fact that America was feeling imperiled by this alternate system of government that was becoming attractive to other people. So what does it look like talking about the evils of communism and the gulags and the things that they had in the Soviet Union and Siberia if Black people were living in sundown towns where they had to be indoors by dark, or they had to sit in the balcony as I did as a child, even after, this is 10 years after Brown, they were still fighting it in my hometown. And when I went to movies with my brothers, we sat in the balcony. When we went to the doctor's office, we went to separate waiting rooms. I integrated our town schools. So this is within my living memory. This is a part of my life, this kind of thing. So how could you and my father was a veteran, to think of somebody who'd gone to Korea and then he comes home and when he takes his daughter to the doctor, he has to be in a separate waiting room with them, a tiny waiting room compared to the waiting room for whites. So King was a part of a movement of lots of people who were standing up and saying, this is not right. And as was noted before, he did have a radical message. He started out talking about getting rid of de jure segregation, legalized segregation, but he also understood that poverty and class, those things mattered as well. And eventually he became a critic of the Vietnam War, but his vision broadened. Well, first place, he'd always had a vision about poverty and inequality, but I mean, mainly his speaking out against the Vietnam War, that was branching out a bit, and that was controversial on the part of other people, for some people, but he saw it all as all of a piece. There's not just one tiny little part of this that you could fix. There was a bigger question about humanity. And this takes me back to this notion of his citing of the American Declaration of Independence. What could be more radical than saying something like that it's self-evident that all men are created equal? If you believe that, things flow from that. And the kinds of things that interested King, the kinds of things that he fought for were part of that, were contained in that idea of equality. If we take that seriously, we can find answers to problems. All of the things that plagued us before grew out of this notion that some people were superior to others, that some people's lives mattered more than others. So the radical vision of King was always there. It has been, as Reverend Dyson said before, Professor Dyson said before, it's been co-opted to some sense. People like the sort of safe king, but not the king who was talking about equality, which, as I said, suggests things that we must do if we want to achieve that particular ideal. Now, this is an interesting time, as I started out saying. We've been in really two moments. We had this sort of the pre-January 6th moment and the post-January 6th moment. In the pre-January 6th moment, we were still living in the sort of age of George Floyd. One of the more, I think, astonishing things that has happened in America in many years. I mean, the response to his killing was something that King would have recognized. I mean, this is in the spirit of what Dr. King was trying to say, the responsibilities we have as citizens to look out for one another. It was an occasion, it was a tragedy, but it was an occasion of the aftermath of this was an occasion to me of hope, because in every state in the Union, thousands of people came out. They came out to voice their protests, to voice their concerns, to say Black Lives Matters. For as much as people try to discredit that particular movement, the original idea was clear. It's not that white people's lives don't matter or no one else's lives matter. It was that Black Lives Matter too. Is really the two was the sort of silent modifier there to explain what we're talking about. Because in a world where African American people who are committing misdemeanors end up dead after encounters with police, when we have every reason to believe that if they had been a different race, that would not have been the result. You have to say Black Lives Matter. And that movement had, as I said, people had worked hard to discredit it. And it was just amazing to me to see how that came back after the killing of George Floyd. And in every state in the Union, every major city, protests, and some of them were not peaceful, but the vast majority of them were peaceful protests in the United States. And then, more to my astonishment, all over the world, Tokyo, London, Paris, everywhere, South America, North America, and Africa, every place, people saying the words Black Lives Matter in places where there are not that many Black people, and places where they probably should look at themselves and their attitudes towards the people of color in their midst. But it was heartening to see that, because it means that spark, the spirit that King tapped into, that he had and that he tapped into, is still there. And people really want to stand up for humanity and wanted to make that known. So in the midst of the sadness of the tragedy and understanding that this kind of thing happens all too often in the United States, that was a ray of hope that we could come together as people. People want to come together and stand for something that is good. That's the pre-January 6th moment. The January 6th moment, the post-January 6th moment, is a bit sobering, because there you had people, if there's a vivid reminder of a notion of first and second class citizenship, what happened on that particular day makes that plain. Because people have said it 1,000 times, and I'm going to say it again, it's very difficult for me to imagine what would have happened if a group of Black men had showed up at the Capitol and stormed it. First place, intelligence would have been done on it. There would have been sufficient forces to repel them or to keep them in check. It's very likely that deadly force would have been used. I don't advocate deadly force, but there would have been a measure, there would have been something to counter if people had started to engage in violence in it. So you see, we'll see what happens with this. I can't speak right now. I don't know what people are going to be charged. Most of the charges now, as has explained, is that they were just sort of giving low charges to begin with. Some of those might be raised later on as the investigation is done, as time goes on. Right now, the point was to get these people sort of on the hook, with trespass, and then we may move on to other things. But the idea, these people who could go into this place thinking that they had the right to be there and do those things, and be surprised when people, when they're arrested, shows you a different attitude. I don't think that African-American people would have thought that they could do something like that, but we'll see how it plays itself out. But this is an important point and another inflection point here, because there's clearly an attitude, in my opinion, of different types, different levels of citizenship, people thinking that the country is theirs in a way that it doesn't belong to other people, calling themselves patriots. And they may think of themselves as patriots, but I think it's something to really investigate and think about. The definition, what do they mean by patriot as opposed to other people who are not their same race and who don't share the same values that they do. Americans, we've been able to, for the most part, going along, to disagree and at the same time have elections and accept the results of the elections, even if you're disappointed. And I've been bitterly disappointed a number of times as a voter. But I understand that what you do in a democracy is you move on. You say, let's come back and we'll try to make our message stronger. We'll try to get more people and we'll do it next time. And that's what we do. But if we get to a point that we don't see one another as equal citizens or having an equal right to citizenship, an equal claim on the democracy, all the kinds of things that Dr. King hoped for have no chance of surviving, ever having a chance to flourish, I should say. Because if we can't agree basically upon that idea, those ideas, then it's hard to think of us meeting on other planes and actually coming together. So I was hopeful before. I'm hopeful now. I tend to be an optimistic person just in general, but we have a problem here that Dr. King, I don't know whether he would have been surprised by it or not, but this is a different world with social media, with the way people, get information, the way people, clump together in their various groups and don't talk to other people and don't get not a cross current of ideas. So a lot of the things that he wanted to achieve is going to be difficult to do in the environment we're in. What happened before January 6th, however, still gives me hope that people want to do it, that there's a yearning to come together. There's a yearning for community. And I just have to hope that yearning is something that we could turn into something that will help us live up to the ideals in the Declaration, that sort of equality that Jefferson talked about, that I think he believed but had no idea how to make real in the society that he was born into the world that he lived in. He didn't believe that African Americans could live in a multiracial society, but I often tell this story about his will. And when he dies, the Virginia law said that if an enslaved person was freed, they had to
get permission to stay in the state, or they could be sold into slavery if they stayed there for more than a year. He petitioned the legislature to let the 5 men he freed remain in Virginia. And he explained, because this is where their families and their connections are. And there isn't any greater understanding, greater reason for why African Americans belong in America, why we love the country, why we should be considered equal citizens than those words. That is where their families and connections are. That's what it's all about. And I think that kind of understanding is what we have to take forward if we're going to make Dr. King's dream a reality. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. I always seem to forget that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Annette, for those wonderful words. Wide-ranging and give us lots to talk about, which I'm looking forward to. And let me introduce our panel very quickly so we can get into it. First of all, Dr. Sharron Conrad is a postdoctoral fellow at SMU's Center for Presidential History. She holds a BA from Penn State University, an MA from Howard University, and a Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Donna McBride is a retired professor of history after several decades of teaching at both the university and secondary levels. She is a Dallas Institute Fellow and leader of its popular monthly book discussion group, The Historians. And Dr. Kenton Ramsey is assistant professor of African American literature at UT Arlington with an affiliation in the Department of History. He is a graduate of Morehouse College and received his PhD in English from the University of Kansas. So let me begin by asking our panelists if they might have some general responses to Professor Gordon-Reed's presentation. And can we use first names during our conversation, please? So what about it, panelists? Who wants to jump in there first? I know
I'll
none of
jump
you.
in. I'll jump in if I may. Sure.
Okay, Donna.
I was really struck by, I think, the central question throughout all of Annette's talk, and that is the question of who are the people? You know, that takes us back to Jefferson's words. Who was he really referring to when he wrote that? Sort of the lack of pragmatism about exactly how does this work out. But I think who are the people is the same question then that Martin Luther King Jr. is also asking us now when he says, you know, how much longer do we have to wait? You know, we've been asking this question over and over again as we do this. So who are the people? What does it mean to be inclusive? When we say it's self-evident that all men, by implication, all people are created equal, what does that mean? I think also the question in the present day, but even back then, that Annette raised, and that is, what does it mean to be a patriot? What does a patriot mean when they define who the people are? And I think kind of pulling what pulls all that together, and again brings us back to Martin Luther King Jr., is the idea of moral authority. Where does the moral authority lie in defining who the people are? And Annette brought us back several times to our American creed, and that is to the Declaration of Independence and the way that is worked out and worked through in the Constitution. And I know that is language, that sense of moral authority. In your America's Original Sin essay, Annette, you use the term the vaulted language, which I just love, to refer to that. And MLK also used vaulted language. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that what we're struggling with today, what Jefferson struggled with in his own day, what MLK, using moral authority, tried to ask us, how do we live this out, is this fundamental question that we've never really defined. Mm-hmm. Who are the people?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's aspirational. Part of the difficulty is that these words are lofty, and it's something that we're striving for mm-hmm. to get to. At the same time, there are practical things that have to be done. There are problems that were created by slavery and the legacy of slavery that have to be dealt with. And there are things we have to admit, things that we have to understand what that was and what that did not only to African Americans, but to whites and to this country as a whole, the ways in which we still respond to one another, that some people respond to African Americans as if we are not fully people and not certainly citizens. So we're not far from that too. That's the other thing. We're great grandparents. My great grandmother's mother was enslaved as a child. That's not that long ago, mm-hmm. and we're still playing we're still living all of these things out, but we haven't. I mean, the 14th Amendment tries to define who the people are. I mean, mm-hmm. the 14th Amendment transforms the Constitution, and we talk a lot about the founders and the Constitution. What people typically think of as 1787 to 1789, but the 14th Amendment gives us a whole new world. And we don't even know who those people are. I mean, we don't worship that in the same kind of way. That gives us a sense of who the people are. The question is, do people accept it? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yes. They're, even from people who don't accept the 14th Amendment, don't like the reason I think we don't talk about it, we don't worship those people as founders, is because they give us a world that I don't think people are really ready for. Some people are not ready for, and that is a world of equal citizenship where the people is clear. The legislative intent was to bring Black people into citizenship. That was the task at the time. And I think the jury is out for some people. I think most Americans want or live and let live and want to go. They have hopes for their families and understand other people's hopes for their families. But there are enough people who question that to make it tough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ron or Kenton?
Well, it's interesting. You talk about the 14th Amendment and how just not everyone was quite ready for that or is ready for that. And one of the things that struck me from Annette's talk is just how the way that you talked about the fact that in the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson unleashed something, that was perhaps not anything that he would have been able to understand or foresee, kind of the implications of his own words and the way that those words would be read and interpreted by people that he himself would never have envisioned interpreting them in the ways that they have. And so just that kind of sense that you said that Dr. King was the product of a process, mm-hmm. And that, he's listening, he is invoking Jefferson's words. He's invoking Lincoln's use of Jefferson's words, and mm-hmm. how that even though people maybe didn't perhaps weren't ready for Dr. Martin Luther King to mm-hmm. interpret the 14th Amendment the way that he did, or to interpret Jefferson's words the way that he did, he was ready. He was mm-hmm. listening to those words. And so many of our people and people of color and people who were not included in Jefferson's vision of, what an American could be, have looked to those words. And I just think it's like this beautiful irony that those words kind of give power to people and continue to give power to people. And so as you talked about kind of this long civil rights movement and the way that, King is connected to W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter and the work of the Niagara movement in the early NAACP and on and on. I'm struck by the kind of connection and the fact that, over and over again, you have African Americans challenging presidents, really starting with Washington, decide like Phyllis Wheatley deciding that she has a voice and she can communicate and correspond with George Washington, or, Benjamin Banneker connecting with Jefferson, just on. And with Dr. King, meeting face to face with multiple presidents, with Kennedy, and saying that, it's kind of hard to teach a president about civil disobedience, but he's taking that on. And so I'm struck by and heartened by the idea that even if other people don't see our citizenship or don't see kind of how we belong, we see it, and we are invoking those words, and we're using them. We're making them even more powerful and doing our part to make the country realize that vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's the part of, well, the wonderful thing about the humanities, the wonderful thing about good writing too, is that, a poem, words, a person puts things on paper, and you just don't know how others are going to interpret it. Who's going to take it, and what they're going to do with it, how they're going to make it their own. So that's a lesson. I think Jefferson talked about the equality of mankind. I think, he said when someone challenged him about this, what about, Black people? You can't say this because you have, you have people who are enslaved, you have these. It was just, he was in a situation where he really could not envision his fellow Virginians or himself, how they could get to the point of doing away with slavery without fighting. And he wasn't going to say that. He wasn't going to make that suggestion to people. But these were ideas that he had even before he wrote the Declaration. I mean, he in freedom, the first time he uses that kind of concept, and other people were using these words as well, was in a freedom suit. He was representing a man who was suing for his freedom. And he tried to make the argument that all men are born free and equal. And of course, that got nowhere, because if the court accepted that, that would be the end of slavery in Virginia, and that wasn't about to happen. So here's a person, I think, who had an intellectual beliefs that he emotionally just could not live up to. And that is not something that's unusual, but that's his particular story. As for King, as a part of a process, I think in some ways to me, that's a heartening thing too. It emphasizes that change doesn't come about just because of one person who just, who does everything. We need leadership, and inspirational leadership is important, but this is a process. And if it's a process, that means lots of people can participate in it, that we all have something that we can do, a way of contributing to all of this, whether it's being a lawyer, challenging the all-white primary, whether it's, challenging public accommodations or whatever. So this being a part of this process, I think or people who prepared dinner and things for NAACP lawyers who came to town, gave them a place to stay, did those kinds of things. We can all make a contribution. And I think people want to be useful. And if it's all about just the great leader who sort of appears out of nowhere, then that makes it's too much like lightning striking. And it's not about lightning. Things happen because people make them happen. And we should all be a part of the people who want to make something happen, to do our bit, whatever that is, to contribute to that process. So we do need a king to come along and be inspirational, that the groundwork has been laid for that person to do what he or she can do, to use their talents to move things forward. But it's a process of a lot of people doing things. And to me, that's a hopeful kind of thing, because it means we can all contribute and be a part of it.
Thanks, Annette. Kenton?
Yeah, this has been great. First off, I'm always excited that we can get together to actually talk about King, ask questions about King on the day to commemorate him. It's an active type of way of commemorating his memory. Professor Gordon-Reed has really made some points. That one point that really stuck with me was she said that King, he always understood that poverty and class mattered. And then over his life, he started to do things that were controversial. He started speaking out against the Vietnam War. So I really like to think about King's life in decades or in eras, so to speak, a very short life. He started Morehouse College in 1944 at the age of 15. Randall Jelks talks about how Benjamin E. Mays really played a part in sculpting his idea and imagination about what the world can be. But I really love the 60s for King, because I think this is where it really ties into what Annette was talking about this idea about poverty, inequality, and how it evolved over his lifetime. In 1963, he says, and I love this as an English professor, he's signifying and checking on the Constitution a little bit, saying, instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. He's talking about the real thing, money. This speech, Normalcy Never Again, was later renamed I Have a Dream for that famous refrain. But then we to May 1967, and King says, we have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. And he begins to say we must ask questions, simple, basic questions about humanity. And this must be the era of revolution. He says we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. In November, we know that he began planning the Poor People's Campaign. So I really like that Annette shined light on this idea of King as evolving in questions that he asked, become involved with the Montgomery bus boycott at 26, and how he evolved even into his 30s to think more critically about poverty, and more so putting poverty in an international context, and the poverty of the South, and extending out of that to think about how would welfare programs benefit not only African Americans, but again, how does this also lift the South up? So I really like this idea of signifying on the Constitution, and how King started cleverly playing with that so much, as a poet even, that we also get to see his work as a civil rights leader, but we also see him as this poet, this person that's very crafty with verse, and also a way to really illustrate how the American Constitution should indeed lift up African Americans. And I like the way he uses hypocrisy in the most respectful way. So Professor Gordon-Reed, really thank you for leading us in this type of thought process, particularly as we're talking about King's evolving thought process and consciousness.
Well, just think about, I did a review of 5 books for the New York Review of Books, and a review of Peniel Johnson's book about King and Malcolm X. And one of the things that struck me about all 6 of those books that you're reading about him is, and this is natural, of how you would grow, what you would learn doing all these kinds of things. He starts out as a precocious, brilliant person to begin with great communication skills and so forth, well-read, who has thought very deeply about these matters and was always radical. I mean, he pronounces himself, he was more socialist in orientation. He says that as a very young man. And but you think about issues of poverty and economic power, all those kinds of things come to the fore. You're fighting against de jure segregation, but then you begin to see all the pieces of the puzzle. And so it's only natural, if he's an intelligent person, always learns from learns from the things that you experience. And there was the seed was always there, the beliefs were always there. But I think by the end, he could begin to see how it was all fitting together. And that bothered lots of people. I mean, it's one of the most astounding things that looking at all these books and thinking about King is how hated he was at the time. He was constantly under death threats and so forth. And now he's become almost this sort of benign person. You forget that people really didn't like, lots of people really feared him and hated him. And we have to keep that in mind. And when I said before about telling the truth and thinking about the reality of white supremacy, reality of what actually happened, you can't really understand who we are unless you face that. And sort of sugarcoating him and making it seem as if he was always this beloved figure really misses something about the country and how hard it's been to change.
Isn't another key point with Dr. King also is he was a pastor, and for him, seeing everything was part of a pastor's job. He was, I've always thought that King really saw himself as the pastor, and I use that in the sense of shepherd for the whole country, that if he just presented truth, that we would get it, which means he had a way higher opinion of us than I do of us. But there was a sense always that was part of his pastoral role. We were talking about how do you get people to understanding that we the people really is all the people. Jefferson argued it was through education. That was the whole point of the University of Virginia. We're going to raise the right group of young men, and then they will go on and follow these aspirations. And whereas MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., he takes us back to not just the education, the civic virtue, but the moral virtue also. And he says, that's us. That's what this country is. That can be our meeting point. That's going to give us the proper definition of what a citizen of a democracy / republic should be, in which truly all people are seen as equal, because we're seen that way through the authority of education, but also through the authority of God, which is how Dr. King saw it. And I think that pastoral role becomes a part of it. And then exactly as Kenton said, he's such a brilliant, persuasive writer, so gifted with language. And to be able to interweave these ideas, Letter from Birmingham Jail, I think, is where you see that the most clearly, is where he's interweaving these ideas. But it's no wonder he came to talking about poverty in the end, because that is part of his role, which is to say it's the whole person that we need to be speaking to. And if that person's hungry, then we need to feed them.
Well, that's an important part. And another thing that came through in the books that I was reading and studying and reviewing is that Christianity, his religion, is really important. I mean, we are basically a secular society, and there may be some discomfort, Jeffersonian discomfort with bringing God and Christianity particularly into it, but it's through and through that his philosophy is the basis of his philosophy. And we just have to recognize that. And that may be discomforting to people, because we like to talk about things in terms of, in secular terms, but you don't really understand him without understanding how the teachings of his church matter to him, what it meant to him, that's the basis of all of his thinking. And for us, there's a way for people who may not be religion, or anyone who's not religious, to sort of see what he's doing and admire it and put these in ethical terms. But it's critical to think of him as a pastor, to think of him, his Christian philosophy was at the heart of his beliefs. And that too, along with the radicalism, that too has been sort of glossed over in a way. People don't think about how essential that was to him.
Well, I just wanted to add, just building on that, thinking about his training and his role as a pastor, this, as Kenton was talking about with, the radical side of King and how that comes through over time, and especially in his speech at Riverside Church on against Vietnam. one of the things that he talks about in that speech is just how, he was thinking a lot about these issues, but when he thought about the responsibility that was on his shoulders in terms of being a Nobel laureate, he had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he felt like that gave him extra responsibility to speak on these questions of peace and to kind of internationalize these issues, so that, as we were talking about, it wasn't just about desegregation of public venues, but even in the I Have a Dream speech, it's Kent mentioned as well, he starts off talking about economics. That is the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And so that, it's already there, and he is just totally expanding out. But that by the time in 1967, when he's speaking out on Vietnam, his worldview is all these things are coalescing, and he is thinking about kind of like his responsibility to speak on these issues, and how hard it is to speak, and how hard it is to be an independent thinker and to act on your morality. But he kind of talks the audience through that process, and how, he hadn't always spoken out on those things, but at that moment he was recognizing his role, his responsibility as a pastor, but also his responsibility as a peace advocate, and his responsibility as a citizen of the world. Yeah. And so I just think that that's such a, we don't talk enough about King in these kind of eras, and his growth over time. But I do like to think of it in terms of that context of his being kind of this minister, this thinking philosopher who is constantly kind of pondering these issues and reflecting on it, and then ultimately, speaking.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to your statement that it's about a citizenship. I mean, this idea that African Americans should only be talking about Black things. Okay, you deal with the desegregation that's in your bailiwick, but what right do you have to talk about foreign policy? Well, he's an American citizen. He has a right to talk about foreign policy, the policies of government that we support. All those kinds of things. That's, taking that upon himself, that I can speak. I have a voice, not just about the things that you think I ought to be talking about. And I mean, it's not just, it doesn't affect King. I can remember, over the years, people looking askance at African Americans talking about foreign policy as if we don't, like, we live in this country and we're only supposed to talk about the Black things, ostensibly Black things. Well, foreign policy is a Black thing too. Anything that affects the United States of America affects United States citizens, affects us. So we can talk about it. So for him to have that kind of, the freedom, his taking it upon himself to speak about matters that, anything that he thought interested him and was in interest as a pastor, as a citizen, as a person, he just, he did it. And that's the courageous thing, one of the many courageous things about him.
One of the things that I really like as we're talking about King, and even using this word radical in a sentence with King, I really like how we're doing that simply because, King is someone I've had to grow to appreciate a lot more as a scholar and even as a person. Simply, I think, coming up with college, even in Morehouse, where King is a focal point of so much, it's always this conversation, Malcolm or Martin, who would you be with in some types of way? And a lot of times, as my younger self, I would think, King was sitting here, it wasn't as radical. It didn't speak to me. But I give King this idea of being radical because he was talking about redistributing money, putting money in poor people's pockets, but not just necessarily in America, but the world over. What does it mean to be poor in America? What does it mean to be poor in Vietnam? So even when I say this idea of King's dream, I think about it as twofold. On the one idea, it's not this idea of racial assimilation, but again, racial integration, and it's give and take from both cultures. But again, his dream is seriously rooted in economic principles, basic principles about what do you need to live. And I really, again, as I said, I'm so thrilled by us using this word radical, us talking about money, especially as it relates to King now in 2021.
Mm-hmm. So just as I predicted, our time is just about up. where did it go? But I would like to take just a few minutes and ask you all, because this seems to be, Annette, you talk about pre and post January 6th. Something is unfolding here that we don't quite know about yet, right? As we go forward. But one of the things that does seem certain to me is that there are more opportunities and more need for educating citizens than ever before. And maybe part of this will be a rediscovery of Dr. King, not just the I Have a Dream speech, but his other substantive speeches, the things that he said and everything. But I'd like to hear you all talk just a few minutes about what's out there that we need to be reading. I mean, I would say, obviously, Annette Gordon-Reed's The Hemingses of Monticello. I mean, it's an amazing book, and it taught me so much about slavery, about white supremacy. What are some other things that you all, and maybe I could ask you, Annette, to start with what's out there for you?
Well, I mean, I did mention Black Reconstruction, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Eric Foner's Reconstruction, the book that explains, I keep coming back to that because there's such a critical period in our history, roads not taken, that really, and why they weren't taken. I think that's important to think about. Eddie Baldwin is my favorite author. I think you can't go wrong with James Baldwin. His essays are timeless and explain, and because it really gets you to think about the nature of the problem that we're in. His essays do that in ways that are just amazing, and I always come back to them.
Kenton, you would agree with that, I know, wouldn't you? You're a real advocate of Baldwin. Any other things that you're reading now, or you could point us to?
Yes, of course. You can't go wrong with Baldwin. And of course, I would always add Ralph Ellison as well, just because just interesting to think about his take, particularly, I think Change the Joke and Slip the Yoke is one of my favorite ones, particularly at this time now, think about January 6th. To get a little bit more context on King, I mentioned Professor Randall Jelks before, but again, Schoolmaster of the Movement that chronicles the life of Benjamin E. Mays is one that I would really suggest, simply because it is an idea about King, about what influences shaped King, and he didn't come out of the thin blue sky. And as we're again talking about King, this other revolution, I just must mention Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Because this is something very serious going on right now that is, again, driven by profits that seem to terrorize poor people of the United States and the world over.
That's great. Thank you, Kenton. Sharron, what are you reading? What do you want us to read?
Well, I just have to say here on James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison. I was thinking about that. Ellison wrote a wonderful essay that I use quite a bit in my work on. It's called The Myth of the Flawed White Southerner. And in it, he deals with questions of identity, but he truly digs into the question of leadership at the presidential level and gets one to think about what is it that we are really hoping? What do we expect from our leaders? One of the quotes that he includes in that is just that, the idea that he includes in it is kind of that we tend to not really want our presidents to be these political figures who are wielding power and who are doing kind of like the ugly work of politics. We want them to kind of be these lofty people that we don't really see them doing the work of politics. And in that case, he was talking about Lyndon Johnson. And it comes to the forefront of my mind mostly because, we have Joe Biden coming in here at a very difficult time, and he's going to have some tough decisions to make. And I know a lot of people are already going back and forth about, can he work with the other side, or should he try? And there's really a lot of questions about what presidential leadership should be in a Biden administration and how he's going to actually get things done. And so, Ellison comes to mind. But the other book, and I think Professor Gordon-Reed mentioned it, that I'm thinking a lot about is Peniel Joseph's book, The Shield and the Sword, dealing with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and those two different leaders who we think we know, but, in so many ways, they were both radicals and both kind of pushing things forward. And so I think that, reflecting on our leadership and what we think we know about leadership and what our leaders are actually doing is something that I would suggest that people dig into.
Thank you. It's some wonderful classics you all are bringing up, and that's great. Donna?
Well, of course, I'm going to take you to history books. Talking about Reconstruction, Ron Chernow's biography of Grant really makes you see Grant and Reconstruction different. We read that in the historians group, and it was an eye-opener for all of us. Makes you very aware how much the lost cause history permeated history all throughout the United States. Because it's a rethinking of that along the same lines, David Blight's book on Frederick Douglass. I mean, another pivotal thinker. And he goes into a lot of detail. I will warn you, he has not met a Frederick Douglass quote that he doesn't love. And they're all in the book. But because of that, he takes you to some of his less familiar works and really delves into the thinking behind that. And then a more modern look at our society and why we do the first and second class citizenship. And that would be Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which takes you to look at it a different way. And how the fact of color makes it difficult for assimilation to happen, and in ways that we're not always aware of. So those would be my
and her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, too,
which is phenomenal. Yeah, and that's a pleasure to read. That's stories of interesting people. So that's a delight to read.
It's a big book, and you're sorry when you're done with it. We had Isabel just after she did The Warmth of Other Suns, and she was pretty wonderful.
Yeah.
So.
She's fantastic.
I'm so sorry that we're out of time. We could go on and on. Yeah. And, it's been enlightening for me and for all of us. And so thank you very much for everything. Annette, thank you so much for being with us on this MLK Day.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sharron, Donna, thank you for a wonderful evening. God bless you all. And let's keep fighting the fight.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Good evening.
Stay safe.
Evening.
Good.
Good evening, you all.